Hello, everyone. I'm your host for today's 𝗪𝗵𝘁 podcast. I'm Laura Greiner, and with me today, I have Dr. Benny Mote, who is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska. How are you today, Benny?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, we're glad to have you on today. Benny, before we get started with our conversation, maybe it would be a good idea for you just to give our audience a little bit of background about who you are and what your experiences have been in the swine industry.
So I'm one of the people that can say I definitely grew up in the swine industry as I was born into it. My father has been in the swine industry his entire life as well. So I was born in. I even before school, I would go with him to his job as a manager. I'm not sure you can necessarily do that today. You have a little 4 or 5 year old kid running around, but I would go with him when he was working. Some of my early memories are helping move little wean pigs from farrowing over to nurseries, and then it was put them in the back of the pickup and move them across the way. So to say that pigs is ingrained in me is definitely there. From there, I guess most of my younger life, I grew up in Happy, Texas. I tell everybody it's a great place to be from. It's a good talking point. Everybody will recognize that. Did 4-H and FFA, showing pigs from county up to the state level. Then after high school, I actually spent 3 years in the Army, bounced around a little bit, was only stationed in the U.S. Following that, I went to University of Nebraska here. I actually did my undergrad. I was on both the livestock and meats judging team when I was here. I was actually active in a lot of internships between the U.S. Mark out at Clay Center, and then even with Monsanto. So I was very active in internships, and then went and did my PhD under Dr. Max Rothschild there at Iowa State, working on sow longevity, trying to find candidate genes for that. And then in 2008, I took my first job, I guess adult job, if you will, with Fast Genetics. The first 2 years I worked out of Canada in Saskatoon. And then after that, the next 5 years, I worked out of a home office just outside of Ames, where my wife was living at the time. We were separated for the first couple of years. And then in 2015, I had the opportunity to come to UNL as the assistant professor and swine extension specialist for the state, with a 60% extension appointment and 40% research, and have been active and busy here at UNL ever since.
Wonderful. You certainly had quite a few life experiences along the way.
Definitely.
But pigs have always seemed to be a part of that. And so I think that's a wonderful story to tell.
From the time I was about in 5th grade to leaving for the Army, I did all the processing in the farrowing house. And so when I came back home that first break when I was in the Army, my dad told me, "You got a lot of pigs you missed." And I said, "I was in the Army. How was I supposed to process them?" So I've definitely got my hands dirty and my boots dirty along the way.
Wonderful. Well, one of the things, Benny, that you and I have visited a bit about is really with your experiences at the University of Nebraska. One of the things that you're passionate about is talking about sows and sow longevity, which is very much a key issue that we talk about in the swine industry, certainly with survivability and performance and the economics of replacing a sow. Sow longevity should be on the top of our list. So let's just start with some generalities. What have you seen over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of sow longevity? Anything that's significantly changing or stands out to you that we need to address right away?
I think one of the bigger take homes is that we've been talking about sow longevity for decade, 2 decades now, and the needle hasn't gotten any better. And matter of fact, it's probably actually gone worse. And so, we need to step back as an industry and go, what has changed, or what are we not doing that we should be doing? I don't think it's necessarily the size of the farms. I think we get big farms that are good, we get little farms that are good, and we get the opposite of that as well. So to me, it's going to come back to, I think, having people in the barn that understand the animal and can manage the animal they have in their barn.
Yeah, I think that's what surprised me. Not that long ago, I was reviewing some data, and if you look from even 5 or 10 years ago, reasons for sow removal are still pretty much the same. And the percent associated with lameness hasn't changed. And we've talked lameness and foot quality for years. And so, where do we go? Right. I think that's kind of where we sit here and scratch our heads and say, we've talked about it, we've identified the issues, we go into barns, we tell people, okay, get the sows up, watch for weight bearing on legs, treat, so forth. How do we change this needle? Do you have any thoughts immediately?
Yeah, I think it's going to come back to what animals get loaded onto the truck, and maybe and it probably starts well before that, but definitely which animals get selected to go to the sow farms at whatever size. I know I've been in situations where I've seen gilts selected on farms where you wonder if they went past that second pin to go down and find the gilts to ship. You find the ones closest to the loadout chute, and okay, it kind of walks, it gets loaded. So we need to get beyond that mentality, get a little extra incentive back to the selectors and make sure they have the time to actually go down through those gilts and select them. Not just give them an order last minute, say they got to go tomorrow, and they go through. That's when they do just go to the first couple pins and pull gilts and ship them. So and we need to raise those gilts like they are going to be replacement females. We don't need to raise them off in the side of the barn as grow finish pigs. We need to raise them like they're going to be the engine for your profitability. And to me, those are the places where I think it starts.
A couple of things that stood out when you were talking there. One thing I can always remember is we have our gilt development unit, our replacement females are there. We go in for selection, and we give the farm staff a rule of 85% you need to select. Is that a fair number to say, let's just set and say this percent of the population would be acceptable?
Ooh, I hate using a set number, and depending on what those pigs have already gone through, I don't think I go to 85. In my mind, I guess I was always looking at about a 70%. So kind of where that's at. But you give people a number, and they're always able to try to hit that number. Um, One of my earliest memories with Fast is when we were still fairly new shipping into the U.S. and we had a customer that wasn't pleased with some of the gilts, particularly on feet and legs. So I was in, and another person was in, specifically selecting the loaded gilts to go to that customer, with the CEO of the company standing in the alley right behind us as we were going through and marking keep gilts and cull gilts. And with the CEO going, I can't cull that many, I won't stay in business. And with my friend and I going, but if you sell these gilts, you won't be in business. And so, to tell somebody you have to have that percentage, they can always hit the percentage to go on the truck. It's, having the people to know, or giving your selectors the leeway to say, I can't get that with this set, but if you let me go one age group older or one age group lower, I can get you those gilts. And I think that would help a lot. Obviously, you need the throughput, but if you just have that target, they'll always hit it. They'll always be able to ship 85%, 70% out the door.
Yeah, and that's something that I actually think is an interesting statement in itself, because you often wonder, for all of the gilts that we raise as gilt replacements in the United States, what percent of them should we truly define as being acceptable into the population? And I'm not saying, okay, let's give the farm staff a number, but really, how many animals should we think about as far as the whole pool in the United States are really set up to be replacement females?
Yeah, and the point on that, and there's ebbs and flows in the gilt flow, oddly, as to what is acceptable, even though it's roughly the same genetics all the time. You wonder kind of what those little intricacies are that get you to that point. But being able to have that number and get them out the door is always kind of interesting.
The other thing you said in that first statement really went around raising them as if they are going to be our engines for the next generation. What does that mean to you? Right? So is it space? Is it feed? Is it vaccine strategies? What in your mind are some things that we should be thinking about that hold that animal different?
So I think feed and space are the ones that most people gravitate to, and I think those are your starting points. Making sure, and I'd even probably throw in flooring on that as well. There's several people out in the industry will talk about if you do this certain thing on flooring, the 2/3 solid, 1/3 slats, or different type of slats, how they can get a different selection rate on their gilts. And so I think we need to come back and take a look at that even on the slat side as what we're doing. And also, having, instead of just checking on them once a day, they're your future. Have people check on them a couple of times a day. If you catch some of those things early, you can turn more things around. You can catch things from going off the rails, if you will. Just so, do it early. As if you ever get to that point where you're having to dig deeper in your gilts, the next time those females cycle through, you're just kind of be in that death spiral where you keep having to dig deeper into that set of replacement gilts because the set you had before, they weren't set up for the future. So we want to stay away from that death spiral when it comes to replacement females.
What are you seeing in terms of technology that can help us predict sow longevity or just even that process of identifying animals that are appropriate for the herd?
So this is one of the fun topics research topics I get to work on. And so here at UNL, we have a system, we call it NewTrack, where we use kind of off-the-shelf security cameras, just 2D security cameras. We place it above some gilt pins that were specific for replacement females at a U.S. mark. And we followed those gilts for a week, is 1 week prior to selection. And we went back and looked at some of the metrics that system can track and compared it against how their trained selector, what they did to keep females back. And of the traits that system tracks, we found some things such as the time those gilts spend standing, like the distance they walk, kind of how fast they walk. Those were correlated with being retained as replacement females. And so, several of those things make sense. The gilts that are more comfortable on their feet and legs, they can be up more, they can move more, they aren't really inhibited by anything. So just, that makes sense. We aren't trying to ever take away a job, but if we could come back and augment that and say, here's what that gilt did the last week. With that project we picked up when gilts were going lame before the farm staff could identify them. Because, those systems are in the barn 24/7. They're watching them all the time. And so it was really neat going back and say, yep, we could see the gilt, her trajectory was going down. She wasn't walking as much. And yep, then 2 days later, that's when they pulled her. So it's really neat to get to that level of detail to pick that out. And, for that one on lameness, the velocity, so how fast those gilts are walking, and the distance were two very telltale signs of those animals are not as comfortable as the others, especially when you get into those changes. So that's been a really neat project. We've started the NewTrack on some other things. We've kind of ventured off into several different aspects of it. We've identified that most of those traits, so the time they spend standing or lying or at the feeder, at water, and time sitting, they're heritable. It was actually a little bit scary how high those were. Most of them were in the heritability range of 0.25 to 0.33. So we can make good genetic selection progress on that once we as researchers know what that really means as far as what that does to production. So that technology, I think, is neat because it's not something you can do day of. It can be something that runs in the background of the farm that allows us to augment the selection process. We're also working on some other projects that maybe aren't as far along as that, but using more cameras. And we have a set of females where we started tracking them from 120 days of age all the way through their fourth parity if they last that long. And if they would last that long, we'd have 16 different times where we videoed those animals. And we'd video them from the side, the front, and the rear, so we could get essentially full body structure angles on those. It's interesting to see how those sows change over time, how actually most of the joints get more flexibility to them at times. So, what you might select or what you might deem as acceptable for all of those of us that are judging, we have that ideal angle. Well, knowing that angle changes over time, what is your ideal on a 240-day old gilt or 150-day old gilt when your endpoint is having a parity 3, parity 4? You want them to pay for themselves. So knowing they're going to get a little bit more flex as they age, can you take a slightly straighter female? And I'm not, they still need to have enough flex to put up with the concrete, but you don't want one that's too soft because then they're going to go too far. And I think a lot of us have seen that on gilts, especially the rear legs. As they mature, they get a lot more flex, especially in the rear pasterns, and then their legs start to go under. And then that's where you can run into problems on that side. So, for us, on genetic selection, it's the intermediate is the option, is the optimal. We don't need to be out on the peripheral. You might need to cheat one way or the other, but not all the way out on the end.
I think that's a good point. We sometimes forget that we're selecting these gilts at about 200 pounds and they're going to more than double their weight. And so structurally, there are going to be some changes as they add more weight, more height, more length to their skeleton than when we're looking at them from a selection point.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to graph the growth and the structural growth and the angles. I think we all know the weight metrics on as the females grow, but to actually just say, parity 2, most of them have reached their mature body height, and after that, it's really kind of filling out. And so, kind of what are we doing to them at that point? How are we growing them to affect the structural changes? You don't want to get those younger females too heavy, then they're carrying extra weight on an immature skeleton. So there's lots of balances. We want the females that can grow well. We just don't want to push them to express all that early in life.
Back on the cameras, are there algorithms that these cameras are using? Are you using RFID tags? What are you using to be able to identify your animals over time?
Yes. So right now, the new track system is, I would say, it's very good in the research and development side. The cameras they have great field of view, but in our pig barns, we're usually running with an 8-foot ceiling. So that dictates how much of the pen that we can see. I have a lot of things on my wish list of things we can do once we can get a bigger field of view or put more cameras together. So as of, right now, we're looking at, I'd say, a smaller finishing pen is where we're able to handle nicely. And what the system does, so that we do use some ear tags in there, the Destron fairing sow tags. Most of that is actually for us humans to come back to validate that the system is actually identifying the pigs correctly. So we have different colors and different number sequences, alphanumeric sequences. I wish they were sequential. We aren't quite to that point yet on the tags. But it's for us to verify when the system is calling an animal, a certain animal, that it is. And so these tags, they're non-RFID, they're non-barcoded. It's just using the neural network, the deep learning for the system to actually first identify the pig. And then it uses the tag kind of as a secondary measure to come back in and re-verify. So we've actually had some really good results about some long-term tracking on animals, and where a lot of other systems has failed is when it loses track of an animal to actually come back and reassign that animal to the ID to the correct animal. And this system has been able to do that. So we challenged the system pretty hard early by putting it on a nursery pig. And so nursery pigs love to get in little scrums and piles. And where they start in the pile and where they end up are two completely different points in the pen. And so it's been really nice to watch the system track the animals. And when they're in that scrum, it might not be as important to know which pig is which. But when they pop out and one goes to the feeder or one goes to the water, you obviously want to catch that. So it's really nice to see it when you have this scrum of pigs and then a pig gets up and then, it puts the right tracking on it. It's like, how did you follow that pig through all of that? And so definitely different, than what some of the other systems are doing. But that's one that's really interesting to see. And I tell people with these cameras, we don't know what we don't know yet until you sit there and you watch video on pigs and you look at some of the data coming back out. It's like, oh, okay. Now that kind of makes sense of why we're seeing some of these things. So I tell people really early on, one of the oddities that we picked up is that we had a pig that was never smart enough to use a cup water. It sustained off of what little bit in the cup was left over from everybody else. And so I was actually watching for tail biting in the video, and I just happened to notice that one pig, when he went to the water, he never pushed the nipple to drink. He only drank what was left in it. It was the only pig that we lost out of that trial. It was one that in the nursery, the first week after weaning, he lost 25% of his body weight. And so it's like, who knew we just had pigs that wouldn't learn to drink right? If it was a nipple water, he would obviously either learn to drink or not survive. But it's kind of interesting. And to also try to put proof of concept with some of this stuff. One of the first times we had some data back, it was at a commercial barn, and the fourth day was just really, really different. And we weren't sure what it was. And when we go back and we watch the video, because we could see the data showing, at 10 o'clock in the morning, something was off. And we actually went through and we found, you can see the video where the producer came in, saw something wasn't right, realized his water wasn't on, and went back and turned the water on. And then you watch the pigs go and fight over water for the next 2 hours to get it turned back on. So when we see all these commercial closeouts and they're so variable, and seeing just how much activity that one water event, how much it changed those pigs was phenomenal to me. We're an out of feed event, an out of water event. How much do those really dictate the bottom line at the end of the day? I tell people, we have really small nursery pens, so they're only 4 feet by 7 feet. And these little weaned pigs, when you put them in there, most of the time they average walking about a mile that first day before they come in and settle down and be like, okay, I'm a pig. And so far, most of the time it takes the pigs out to about day 4 before they kind of settle into a pattern of, just kind of being consistent. Their walking comes down to a level, their laying gets to about that level, then things tend to move in a similar pattern for that point on. But to tell people we have little pigs in a little bitty nursery pen that are walking a mile, I had no frame of reference before that. So it's just really something that's really neat and novel to look at and then say, well, how could that help us manage pigs if we know that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I didn't realize a mile either. I mean, you always watch them walk the fence line and they're walking, but that's really intriguing. And you're absolutely right. When you know that and you know the degree in which it's happening, it may change your management style or your approach, whether it's through, some water, nutrition, electrolytes, et cetera, or how you manage that, right?
Yeah, I wonder if, especially in some of the bigger wean to finish facilities, if we don't really need to close those pens down a lot smaller than maybe what we are, knowing that, just let them be in a little scrum, if you will, and settle down, because they're like little ping pong balls. They just move and bounce and move all over the place. So, if there's more objects in their way, maybe they won't go as far and that they will settle down quicker.
Yeah.
But we've done some wean to finish work as well, because one of the first questions we had in mind after seeing how much the animals were moving was, well, how much are they moving, and how much feed are they burning off? And so it was kind of a side project we tried, but we did wean to finish. It was 132 days. The pigs were marketed at roughly 270 pounds. And in our smaller research pens, the pigs still averaged, as I said, we started with 192. They still averaged 77 miles over their life, of that's how far they walked, with a range of a low of 53 miles to a high of 102. And so you have that phenomenal range in pig activity. And mind you, these are pigs that lived to off test. So if you have that much of a range, it's really fascinating as to what that can mean on the feed conversion side. When we looked at that, so roughly every 300 extra feet that those pigs traveled a day was a decrease of, I think it's like 6.6 pounds less at off test. So it makes sense. The pigs that are up and moving are lighter. Now, how can we use that to select for different pigs that may be more efficient? So we have some trials. We're starting going down that route to try to get some feed intake data to truly put those 2 points together. Maybe a way to augment some of the fire feeder data to get a more efficient animal. But again, we don't know what we don't know yet. And it's just fascinating where some of this technology is going to lead us in the future.
Yeah, that's actually really intriguing to me, that thought process. I mean, we certainly know feed efficiency and we can track those pigs, but to think about it from a behavior standpoint is really intriguing. And so you hit the nail on the head, and it ties back to whether or not we're talking about gilt development or you're talking about wean to finish, is taking this information from the current groups and going back and thinking about selection and how we tie this together. And so that's really exciting for me to think about, is that technology giving us the ability to select animals on something a little different than just this phenotypical performance, right?
Yeah. And one project that we have that's definitely out there, because the new track system will also track the XY coordinates of the pigs. So that gives us some fun maps of how they utilize pins, but we also know how they interact with each other then. And so we have we call them the social network matrices, where you can see how close pigs tend to be to each other in a pen. And what we don't know, the ones that are really close, are those the boss pigs that like to always be beside somebody and boss them, or are they the social butterfly that needs to be around somebody? And I can't answer that question yet. We haven't had it. The data is there. So we're actually going to try to take some of that same data from those replacement females and say, okay, those animals that tend to lie next to each other, maybe not as active, how do they perform as a sow? Are those really active ones? Are they the ones we want? Or we want the more laid back ones? What does this mean? And I'll be honest, I don't think we know what it means yet, because we've never had the tool to measure that. And so I told my student, I said, we're going to swing for the fences on this. We'll be able to write it up and report it either way. One way is going to be a lot more fun than the other way, though.
I think it'd be intriguing to take that data and look at it from a housing perspective too, right? If you have females that always want to be touching, are they going to be more genetically suited for group hens versus those animals that want to be off on their own? Are they going to be more ideal for individual? And that alone, right, might affect their performance ability just from a stress level.
Yeah, to find those animals that are not, or don't select on those boss sows, or the ones that are always pushing them around, especially if we go down to the Prop 12 route where we're in big group pens and we're out at day 11 on implantation. We don't want those boss sows being aggressive and causing stress on other sows. So we'd definitely be better to have a non-aggressive pig, especially in that time frame. We still want them to have that drive to get up and go eat and be a pig, but we don't want them to, I guess, do detrimental activities to the other pigs.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you have some really exciting things coming down the pipeline, and I'll be excited to watch what you bring out to the group, because I think it has some really interesting potential benefits to the industry. As we wrap up our time together, Benny, if you have a couple of key points that you'd like our audience to think about today, I'd like to welcome you to throw those out to the group.
So I will probably lead off with that. Having people in the barns that really um, care and have the time to manage our animals is key. Right now we're in a situation where labor is short, but if you can identify those people, get them and hang on to them at all costs. The other thing with some of our work that is in the process of being published, we've identified that some of those foot lesion traits are definitely heritable. It makes sense. We see those, and we see that in other species as well. So we need to take that data, and we need to collect it and get it back to the genetic companies so they can start selecting on that to give us gilts with better feet. But in the same time, we've also identified a management effect. And so a little bit controversial, but we've identified for some of the lesions, it's definitely better to have the gilts in stalls versus pens. So that kind of goes against the big drive, the big push right now for group sow housing. And not saying that we can't find our way around it. We just need to identify it and manage our pens, manage our gilts to avoid some of the feet and leg issues I think we're seeing and maybe even causing by having some of our certain pen setups.
Very good. Well, as we wrap up, we always, as you know, like to ask our guest speaker a couple of questions that everybody gets asked. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, do you have any swine resources that you would recommend to our group?
So I could use a canned reference, and since everybody tends to go with one back to their species, they go with the genetics of the pig, being a geneticist. But to me, I like kind of keep pushing forward and still paying homage to the past. I really like to go through the journal articles to see what people are working on. With the Journal of Animal Science, those ones. Just what are people working on? What are some things where you can keep improving the animals? So I have the history lesson with the genetics of the pig, and then the future of where can we keep going.
Absolutely. How about any books that aren't pig related? Are there any that you're reading or have read that you'd recommend to our audience?
So I guess kind of growing up in West Texas, I've always kind of gravitated back on the Western heritage for some odd reason. And I guess my mom she started me reading a lot on the Louis L'Amour stuff on the Western side. But some of the ones I found more interesting kind of gravitated off of that. And the Empire of the Summer Moon, with some of the things on Quanah Parker and the Comanche Indians in that part of the world, is one I really gravitated to because of just the history of the area and how good they were with horses, and just kind of how they actually kind of fought the Western movement of the colonies. They kind of held it off for so long. It's kind of interesting how one little tribe could have such a big range and territory, and it's because they were such good horsemen with some things. So that group, and especially with the local history, for me, that was a phenomenal book. I really like to read.
Very good. I'll have to look into that one. I have not heard that one before. The last question we like to ask is, if you think about somebody who's successful in the industry or somebody that you view as successful, what's a key trait or quality that they possess that you think helped them become successful?
So when I was an undergrad here at UNL, there's a tradition where we have the block and bridle honoree. And one of the key takeaways from the honoree one year was, the world is run by those who show up. And it seems like such a simple statement. But then when you really start to thinking about it, who shows up to our barns, who shows up to vote, who shows up, who puts in the job application. It is just so true. Those that have the desire to better the world, they show up. The world is just simply run by those who show up.
That's very good. Yes, I've heard that quote many times. I actually see it in some people's email tags, and I think it's a very true statement, particularly for people involved in agriculture.
Maybe not as profound as some of the other statements on here, but one that's you have to start there, or the rest of it doesn't matter.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time today. We greatly appreciate the conversation. I thought it was really fascinating. And as I said, I look forward to some of the work that you'll be releasing, hopefully soon. Again, for our audience, this is Dr. Benny Mote from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you, Benny, for your time.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Take care.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.